Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We're the show that takes a deep look at the sources, the history, and the theology behind topics that matter. We do the readings so you don't have to.
And today, we are doing a deep dive into what is, I think for many, the spiritual core of the Old Testament itself, the Book of Psalms, or as it's often called, the Psalter.
Right. And our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to pull out some of the most critical insights from the sources about its origin, how it's structured, and of course its theological scope. Because for you, our listener, this isn't just a jumble of ancient poems.
Not at all. I mean, the sources frame the Psalms as poems that were intended to be sung, usually with instruments like the harp. That's what the name songs even means.
That gives us the form, sure. But the Hebrew title, Tehillim,
Hmm.
that's where we get the content, right?
That's where we get the purpose. It's titled Praises, or the Book of Praises. And that's really telling, because a huge number of these are actually agonizing laments, not praises at all.
Which suggests the ultimate goal is always praise, even when you start from a place of pain.
It does. And this collection, it was the devotional heartbeat of the Old Testament church. It had a vital place in their worship, a place it's really held right through history, all the way to our own services today.
It's just a remarkable work. And the sources point to this incredible balance it strikes. On one hand, you have the sheer vastness of God, Creator, King, totally sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other, you get these immediate, raw, personal cries from people. Cries of, deep sorrow or just overwhelming joy. It really does cover the whole spectrum of what it means to be human in a relationship with God.
It really is the prayer book that God gave to his people. And what's so interesting in the source material is how much effort has gone into establishing just how old and reliable this book actually is.
Especially after a century or so of pretty intense scholarly skepticism.
Right. And getting a handle on its antiquity is just so key to understanding its authority.
Okay, let's do that then. Let's unpack that whole historical argument, and we can start with the big question that really anchors the whole collection. Authorship, age, and whether we can trust those little notes at the top of the page.
The titles, yes.
When you open up the Psalter, the first thing you notice are those titles, those little superscriptions. And they immediately turn this whole authorship question into, well, a bit of a numbers game.
That's a great way to put it, because when you just tally up the attributions that we find in the Hebrew Masoretic text, David is credited with 73 songs.
73. That's about half the book.
It is, and that number gets even bigger if you look at other ancient versions, like the Greek Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate. In those traditions, David's name gets attached to even more of them.
But it's clearly not just him. The collection is a composite work involving a lot of other figures who were central to Israel's worship life.
Oh, absolutely. Beyond David, you see these direct connections to the Levite leaders who were in charge of the temple music. You've got Asaph, who is the head of a major Levitical singing group.
He's connected with 12 psalms.
12, yes. And then the sons of Korah, who are another key musical guild, they're linked to 11, maybe 12, depending on how you count Psalm 88.
And then we have a few other big historical names thrown in there.
We do. 2 psalms are credited to Solomon. That's 72 and 127. One, a very famous one, Psalm 90, is ascribed to Moses. And then you have individuals like Ethan for Psalm 89 and Heman, who shares credit for Psalm 88 with the sons of Korah.
And the rest.
Yeah.
The ones with no name.
The rest, about 50 of them, are what scholars call the orphan psalms. They just don't have any specific attribution in the main Hebrew text.
Okay, this distribution brings up a technical question, but it's a really important one. It's about the language. When we read a title like a Psalm of David, what does that little preposition of actually mean? Does it always mean he's the author?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The primary meaning, and the one that most of the sources really lean on, is authorship. But, the Hebrew preposition is flexible. We have to allow for other possibilities.
Like what?
Well, when it's applied to a group like Asaph or Korah, it might not mean they wrote it. It could just mean that the psalm was part of their guild's official repertoire.
Ah, so it was of their collection, not by their hand.
Potentially, yes. It could mean they were the ones responsible for performing it or preserving it in the worship setting. But when that same preposition is used for a figure like David or Moses, authorship really is the strongest and most natural reading.
That makes sense. But if we accept that it usually means authorship, we have to deal with the next layer of information. A lot of these titles don't just name an author. They tie the song to a specific critical event in David's life.
Yes, they do. They connect Psalms like 3, 7, 18, 30, and 51 to these particular moments. Fleeing from Absalom, facing his enemies, or dealing with his own deep personal sin.
And this is where that historical skepticism you mentioned comes in. For a long time, the scholarly consensus was that these titles were basically worthless.
It was. Following the work of a very influential 19th century scholar named Julius Wellhausen, the common view was that these were just late additions, that later editors were trying to force these ancient prayers into specific historical stories, even when they didn't really fit.
The idea being that most of the songs were written much later, after the exile.
Exactly. But modern scholarship has, for the most part, moved away from that deep skepticism. More and more, the titles are seen as reasonably reliable guides.
So what's the evidence for that shift? What makes us think these titles are actually ancient and trustworthy?
There are three really strong lines of argument. The first one has to do with translation and chronology. It looks like these titles were added at a very, very early date.
How do we know that?
We know because when the Psalms were translated into Greek, the Septuagint, somewhere around the 3rd century BC, the translators themselves clearly had a hard time understanding the technical terms in the titles.
So the titles were already archaic to them, hundreds of years before Christ.
Precisely. They were wrestling with words and phrases that were already ancient and maybe falling out of use even back then. If the titles were recent additions, the Greek translators would have understood them perfectly. Their struggle is evidence of age.
Okay, that's a strong point. What's the second one?
The second point is about editorial consistency, or maybe the lack of it.
What do you mean?
Well, let's imagine that later editors, centuries after David, were just inventing these historical backstories. If they were doing that, you'd expect them to do it for all the Davidic songs, right?
Sure, they'd want to give a plausible story for everyone.
But they didn't. Only a small fraction of the psalms attributed to David have these specific historical notes. The fact that it's so selective suggests they weren't inventing stories. They were preserving facts that had been handed down with those specific psalms.
And the third point is the most interesting one because it sort of flips a problem into a proof.
This is where it gets really compelling. We can look at cases where there seems to be a mismatch between the title's historical note and the actual content of the psalm.
Okay, give me an example.
Psalm 30. The title says it's a song for the dedication of the temple. But when you read the poem, it feels incredibly personal. It's all about being rescued from a serious illness from the brink of the grave.
That does sound like a mismatch.
It does. But think about it. A later editor, trying to make things neat, would never have invented that title for that psalm. The mismatch suggests the title was supplied by someone who knew an original historical connection that we've lost. Maybe David dedicated something after recovering from a sickness. The fact that the awkward connection is preserved is a sign of authenticity, not invention.
We see a similar little wrinkle with Psalm 34, right? The title says David acted crazy before a king named Abimelech.
Right, but the historical account in 1 Samuel 21 says the king's name was Achish of Gath.
So, a contradiction.
Not necessarily. The sources suggest a simple explanation. It's very likely that Abimelech wasn't a personal name, but a general title for Philistine kings. Kind of like how the Egyptians used Pharaoh.
I see. So these minor issues don't really undermine the whole case. The titles were seen as a guide, helping the worshiper connect the prayer to a real-life situation.
Yes. Even if the titles themselves weren't considered part of the inspired text of the poem, they were a historically valued guide. And all of this evidence just solidifies David's central role. Maybe he didn't write every single one with his name on it, but the core of the Psalter comes from his time.
So let's lay that out. What is the traditional case for Davidic authorship?
Yeah.
The sources list about 6 main points.
They do, and together they build a really strong cumulative case for the time period and for David as the chief author.
Let's start with his established literary skill.
Okay, so point 1. David's other accepted works give us a baseline. We have his lament over the deaths of Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1. It's this beautiful, moving piece of early Hebrew poetry, and it shows his poetic spirit. It establishes that he had the skill and the temperament to be a lyric poet.
So we know he could do it.
Yeah.
And point 2 is that he wasn't just a poet, he was the architect of Israel's entire worship system.
That's a huge piece of it. David had this well-known reputation as a gifted musician, an inventor of instruments, and the one who organized the temple worship. 1 Chronicles goes into great detail about how he set up the Levites and their duties, including the main singing guilds of Asaph, Korah, and Heman.
Even centuries later, the prophet Amos mentions David's musical inventions.
He does. Jewish tradition connects David to the temple music in the same way it connects Moses to the law. The clear implication is that he gave serious, organized attention to how the cultic singing was structured and what was sung.
And the third point connects his personal talent to the national mood. It was a unique time in Israel's history.
It was. The early monarchy, David's time, was a period of really unprecedented national confidence. They'd secured their borders, established Jerusalem as the capital, and achieved a level of stability they'd never known. That kind of environment, a sort of golden age, is the perfect breeding ground for a burst of artistic and creative work.
With the king himself leading the charge.
As the chief patron and contributor, yes.
The fourth point then brings it back to the personal, aligning the spiritual content of the Psalms with the actual man.
And the alignment is undeniable. There's such a close correspondence between David's life, as we read it in 1 and 2 of the Psalms, Samuel shepherd, fugitive, warrior, king, and, a deeply penitent sinner, and the content of the Psalms.
His life was incredibly dramatic, hiding in caves, fleeing his own son, celebrating huge victories.
And all of those experiences match the prayers of faith, repentance, and distress that we find in the collection. Psalm 51 is the perfect example. It's the absolute perfect reflection of the moral disaster with Bathsheba and Uriah.
Okay, so moving beyond the Old Testament, the fifth point is that the New Testament itself validates his authorship.
It does, specifically naming David as the author. In Matthew 22, Christ himself asks the Pharisees how David, speaking in the Spirit, could call the Messiah Lord, and he's quoting Psalm 110. Now, some critics used to argue David was just a shorthand for the whole book.
Like saying, I'm reading Shakespeare when you're reading one play.
Right. But the context in the New Testament really implies a personal author. Acts 1, Acts 2, they all attribute specific quotes directly to the mouth of David.
And the sixth and final point just solidifies his overall influence on the collection.
It does. The substantial core of the Psalter is Davidic, and it's very likely he wrote some of the anonymous Psalms, too. The writer of Hebrews attributes the anonymous Psalm 95 to him, and Acts attributes Psalm 2 to him. So even if you're skeptical of the titles, the overwhelming evidence from tradition, context, and the New Testament points to David as the defining originator.
So we can confidently push back on that old skeptical idea.
We can. The sources are clear. That old Wellhausen view that the Psalms were just the hymn book of the Second Temple, meaning almost entirely post-exilic, that view is now completely outmoded. Modern scholarship overwhelmingly accepts a much earlier date for most of the songs.
What was the big discovery that caused that reversal?
It was mainly comparative studies, looking at the poetry and hymns of surrounding cultures like Egypt and Mesopotamia, and especially the material they found at the Canaanite city of Ugarit.
And what did they find?
They found direct parallels in structure, form, even the language between nearly 120 Israelite psalms and this very early Canaanite material. It strongly suggests that the classical age for writing psalms was during the monarchy, just as the titles claim.
But that doesn't mean every single psalm fits into that early window. There are some clear examples from the exile and after.
Of course. The book grew over a long period. Psalm 137, with its cry by the rivers of Babylon, is obviously exilic. Psalms 107 and 126 refer to the return from captivity. There's even a debate about Psalm 74. Some think it could be as late as the Maccabean period, around 160 BC, though the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC is an equally good fit.
So if these were written over such a long time, who put them all together, and when did it become the final book we have now?
Well, it was a process, a multi-stage growth. The fact that so many Davidic psalms are clustered in the first part suggests that books 1 and 2 were collected pretty early, maybe even near the end of David's life.
And the final editor.
The traditional credit for the final collection and editing goes to Ezra the scribe. And that's a reasonable idea, given his role in reshaping Israel's religious life after the exile.
And we have hard evidence that the whole process was finished by a certain point in history.
We do. It was definitely complete before the Psalter was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, which happened at the end of the 3rd century BC. And critically, we have corroboration from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from Cave 4 at Qumran. They helped confirm the general order of the Psalms as we have them.
That sets the stage perfectly. We know who wrote them and when. Which leads us right into section 2, the structure of the collection and how it was used in Israel's formal worship.
Right, the cultus. Once you get past authorship, the book's connection to the formal worship of the temple becomes impossible to ignore.
The titles are the first clue again, aren't they? They're not just historical notes, they're practical instructions.
They're functional. 55 psalms are addressed to the choir master. That tells you right away this isn't private poetry, it's for public, orchestrated performance. And as we said, another 24 are linked to the professional singing guilds. Asaph, Korah, Hemam.
And this brings us to those fascinating but uh, sometimes frustratingly obscure musical directions that are embedded in the text. Sila is the most famous one.
Silo. It shows up 71 times, and there's still scholarly debate about what it truly means, which adds a bit of mystery to the whole thing.
What's the leading theory?
The most widely accepted idea is that it was a technical note indicating a pause, maybe for an instrumental interlude, or maybe it signaled a crescendo, a moment to raise the volume or the emotional intensity. But it's fascinating. Some sources suggest it was an instruction for the reader to lift their hands, or even a marker for a textual variant.
So we don't know for sure, but its presence proves this was highly structured music.
It does. And what about Higgaion? You see that in Psalm 9?
That's less common, right?
Much less common. It's often interpreted as a suggestion for a meditative attitude during that part of the psalm. It shifts the focus from just the external act of singing to the internal act of contemplation.
We also find titles that sound poetic themselves, but they're actually musical cues, probably referencing popular tunes of the day.
Yes, things like The Hind of the Dawn for Psalm 22 or Lilies for Songs 45 and 80. These were likely existing, well-known melodies that the psalm was meant to be sung to. It's like writing to the tune of Amazing Grace at the top of a new hymn.
And beyond the general musical setting, some psalms are clearly tied to specific rituals or offerings in the temple.
They are. The singing is tied directly to the sacrificial system. You see psalms linked to the memorial offering or a song for the Sabbath for Psalm 92. And critically, Psalm 100 is a psalm for the thank offering. This shows us that the Psalms were the verbal part that gave theological meaning to the physical act of sacrifice.
Could you walk us through how that might have worked in practice, like with a vow offering?
Sure, think about Psalm 22. It begins with that famous cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The first part is a desperate plea.
But then it shifts dramatically.
It does. The second half, from verse 22 on, becomes this powerful song of thanksgiving. And verse 25 explicitly says the psalmist will fulfill his vow before the great congregation. So, having been delivered, he comes to the temple to publicly give testimony.
And that fulfillment of a vow almost always involved a communal meal.
A shared sacrificial meal, yes. Thanksgiving in Israel wasn't a silent, private thing. It was a public declaration followed by a feast, and the psalm provided the liturgy for that whole event.
It paints a very holistic picture. But that raises a big question. How do these very specific ritual-bound prayers written by a king in the 10th century BC become a universal hymn book for the whole nation and then for Christians for 2,000 years?
And the answer to that is one of the most brilliant literary techniques in the whole book, the use of stereotype. The actual specific problem the psalmist is facing is almost never spelled out.
So instead of saying the Assyrian army is at the gates, what do they say?
They use a standard, generalized language of adversity, a whole set of powerful metaphors. They talk about being attacked by wild animals, lions, dogs, bulls. Or they talk about the elemental forces of nature, like waves and floods about to drown them, or the hidden snares and traps of a hunter.
So the key to their wide use is actually the lack of specific detail.
Precisely. This allows songs that started as an individual's prayer to be adopted for communal use. It makes them spiritual models, not just historical records. One of the sources says they become readily usable by others whose distressed circumstances may, in fact, be vastly different.
So your enemy might not be a Philistine warrior, it might be an illness or a financial crisis or a spiritual temptation.
Right. But you can still pray the raw emotional truth of that psalm about escaping the snare of the fowler. The focus stays on the relationship with God and the theological response, not the historical details of the problem.
The stereotyped language makes it timeless. Now let's zoom out and look at the macro structure of the book. It's not random, it's intentionally organized into 5 distinct sections.
The 5-book structure is unmistakable. Book 1 is Psalms 1 to 41, Book 2 is 42 to 72, and so on, all the way to Psalm 150. And these 5 sections are separated by 4 clear doxologies, these short, concluding bursts of praise.
A division into 5 seems, well, it seems too deliberate to be an accident.
It's widely believed to be a conscious imitation of the 5 books of the law, the Torah. By structuring the prayer book in 5 parts, the editors were elevating it. They were placing it right alongside the Torah as a guide for living and worship. It's as if you move from the instruction of the law to the heartfelt response of the songs.
And we have evidence that these 5 books might have circulated on their own for a while before being combined.
We do, and the clearest evidence is duplication. For instance, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are basically the same psalm, but they appear in different books. And the end of Psalm 40 is reproduced as the entirety of Psalm 70. That kind of thing only happens when you're merging previously separate collections.
And the way God is named is different in the first two books, which also suggests two different source collections were brought together.
That's the Elohim versus Yahweh distinction. In Book 1, God is mostly called Lord, or Yahweh. In Book 2, he's more often called God, or Elohim. The final editors even left their fingerprints on the text, like the note at the end of Psalm 72 that says, "The prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended."
Even though we find more Davidic psalms later on.
Exactly. It's the smoking gun that shows they were combining and preserving earlier, independently circulating documents.
It's an incredible work of literary and theological organization. With that structure in mind, let's move to section 3 and talk about the theology itself, what the Psalms teach us about God and about man.
Well, the Psalter as a whole presents this very strong, very consistent view of God. He's not some abstract philosophical force. He is revealed in these deeply personal relationships inside the covenant community.
It's a God-centered book, but one that somehow remains incredibly accessible to the individual.
And that accessibility is helped by the constant use of anthropomorphisms, ascribing human traits to God.
Right, we read about God's voice, his ears, his eyes, his face, his hands.
And the sources are quick to point out that we shouldn't stumble over this. The value of this language is that it makes God feel real, intimate, and responsive to the person praying.
It almost seems like a necessary tool for us to even comprehend God. I mean, how else could a finite person relate to an infinite being?
The source material argues that it is necessary because we have to describe God in terms we can understand from our own experience. The alternatives are either a vague mysticism or a kind of sterile pantheism where God just dissolves into nature. Describing God's actions in human terms doesn't mean we think God is just a glorified man. It just affirms that he is a person who speaks and listens and acts.
And beyond that relational character, the monotheism in the Psalms is absolutely uncompromising.
Oh, completely. Psalms 115 and 139 leave no room for doubt. There is one true God. He's the creator. He sustains all of nature, as you see in Psalms 8 and 95. He's also the Lord of history, directing the fate of Israel and the nations in Psalms like 78 and 105.
What's so unique is that the psalmists never let God's absolute greatness become a barrier to fellowship. They hold his sovereignty and his nearness at the same time.
That is the core theological tension they manage so well. They can celebrate his control over the cosmos in Psalm 19, and in the next breath, they're talking to him as a friend, a fortress, a shepherd, a father. In fact, his greatness is what guarantees the security of their personal relationship.
So let's turn to the doctrine of man. Even with this huge gap between the creator and the creature, man is still given a position of real dignity and responsibility.
Man has this mediating role. Yes, he's a creature. His life is short, as Psalm 90 says. But he's also granted authority over the rest of creation. Psalm 8 says he is crowned with glory and honor. It establishes man's inherent worth.
But that worthy relationship is constantly threatened by sin, which is really the agonizing problem at the heart of all the laments.
It is. Psalm 106 shows how tragically sin disrupts that fellowship. But the Psalter always points back to God's character. It tells us he is gracious, long-suffering, faithful, and forgiving, like in Psalms 103 and 130.
And while the sacrificial system is obviously part of their worship, the Psalms seem to put the emphasis on something much deeper than just the outward ritual.
Overwhelmingly, the stress is on a personal religion that requires sincerity, true obedience, and a surrendered heart. Psalm 40 says, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have pierced." That points to a commitment far beyond just going through the ceremonial motions.
Which brings us to the crucial insight from David's great confession in Psalm 51. It seems to show that when sin is deep enough, the entire ritual system is just inadequate.
This is a profound theological point, and it's central to understanding the covenant. Under the Mosaic law, the sacrifices were mainly designed to cover unintentional sins, sins of weakness, not the brazen, deliberate, high-handed sins like David's adultery and murder.
David's sin carried a death sentence under the law. There was no animal sacrifice prescribed for covering deliberate murder.
Exactly. And David knew it. He knew he was outside the bounds of ritual atonement, so his confession had to bypass the sacrificial system entirely because it was totally incapable of dealing with the depth of his transgression.
He just throws himself on God's mercy alone.
He does. In Psalm 51, he says, "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." It's this powerful confirmation that moral obedience and spiritual brokenness are what God truly desires.
That focus on mercy over ritual is so central to a reformed view of justification. Now, we have to talk about the afterlife. The Psalms seem to capture a moment of theological transition in how Israel understood death.
They do. The traditional Hebrew view centered on a place called Sheol, the abode of the dead. It was generally seen as this shadowy subterranean place where you had a mere existence, but nothing more.
And crucially, your active relationship with God just stopped.
It stopped. You hear this fear from the psalmist in Psalm 6 and Psalm 88. They're terrified that praise and fellowship will end at the grave.
That must have been a terrifying thought for a faithful person, that this precious relationship with the living God would just vanish. How did their faith push them to break with that view?
It was their deep conviction about God's absolute power and goodness that forced the change. The growing understanding that God is almighty and omnipresent led to the thought that even Sheol couldn't be outside his reach. As Psalm 139 says, "If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there." That's a huge shift.
So their experience of fellowship in this life demanded a conclusion greater than eternal separation after death.
Precisely. Faith itself demanded that their covenant fellowship with God could not be terminated by death. They began to hope for vindication, for reception into God's presence. Psalms 16, 49, and 73 show this hope bursting through. The psalmist in Psalm 73 says, "Nevertheless, I am continually with you. Afterward, you will receive me to glory."
It's the theological seed for the later, fully developed doctrine of resurrection, even if it's not fully clear yet in the Psalms. It's an incredible testimony to their belief that God's love is stronger than death.
It is. It's the poetry of conviction winning out over conventional thinking. And this brings us right to our final section, the mechanics of the poetry itself, and how the entire collection ultimately points toward the Messiah.
Before we get to the big genres, we should probably touch on the basics of Hebrew poetry, especially for listeners who are used to Western poetry with rhyme and meter.
It's a completely different system. Hebrew poetry has almost no consistent rhyme and only a very basic meter based on word stress. But its defining feature, the thing that makes it so memorable, is parallelism.
Where the main unit of thought isn't a single line, but a balanced couplet. The second line relates directly to the first, echoing it, contrasting it, or completing it.
Right. And we can break it down into four main types of parallelism that really shape the flow of the poem.
Okay, let's start with synonymous parallelism. This is the most common one, where the lines reinforce each other.
With synonymous parallelism, the second line essentially repeats the thought of the first, just using different words. And it's not just redundant, it's for emphasis. Psalm 1.2 is a perfect example. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Delight and meditates, law of the Lord, and his law, they reinforce the core truth.
Then there's antithetic parallelism, which uses contrast.
This is based on a stark contrast between the two lines, and you see it a lot in wisdom literature. Psalm 1.6 does it perfectly. "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." The contrast makes the moral lesson incredibly clear.
Third is synthetic parallelism, where the thought moves forward.
Right. Here, the second line doesn't just repeat or contrast, it completes or adds to the thought of the first line. It takes the idea one step further, like in Psalm 3.4, "I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill." The second line advances the scene by telling us where the answer came from.
And the fourth type, climactic, builds a kind of intensity.
It's also called stair-like parallelism because it builds on itself. Part of the first line is repeated, and then the thought is carried to a higher conclusion. Psalm 29 is a great example. "Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name." You can feel that repeated phrase building the atmosphere of worship.
We should also briefly mention acrostic poems, where they use the alphabet to structure the poem. This was used to suggest a sense of completeness, wasn't it?
It was. The verses or sections begin with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Psalm 119 is the most famous example. The idea was to suggest exhaustive coverage, that you're saying everything from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z.
With those mechanics in mind, we can turn to the highest theological reading of the Psalms, the Messianic hope. And that hope is really rooted in a specific genre called the Royal Psalms.
The royal psalms, like Psalm 2, 45, 72, 110, are a whole category focused on the historical Davidic king, his rule, and his special relationship with God. And since the monarchy ended in 586 BC, we know these were written before then.
It's so important to be clear about the status of the Davidic king. He was God's representative, his vice-regent, but he was never considered divine himself.
That is absolutely key. The king in Israel was God's son by adoption. He was meant to be the mediator through whom the blessings of God's righteous rule would flow to the people.
But the historical record is pretty clear that the kings, for the most part, failed to live up to that perfect standard.
They profoundly disappointed that hope. And because the historical monarchy ultimately failed and was removed in judgment, the hope for a truly righteous king couldn't just die. It had to be preserved. So that hope was projected into the future. And that projection became the very basis of the messianic expectation.
The failure of the human kings defined the need for a perfect one.
A perfect one. The one God himself would choose. The Messiah. The anointed one. And this is why the early church immediately read these royal psalms as messianic songs. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of the perfect king the Davidic line could never produce.
So let's look at the big three proof texts the New Testament writers used from the Psalms.
Okay, first up is Psalm 2. It's quoted all over the New Testament, in Acts 13 and Hebrews 1. It talks about the king being given the nations as his inheritance, having universal rule. That scope goes far beyond anything David or Solomon ever achieved. It points to Christ's incarnate ministry as the anointed king who establishes a universal kingdom.
Second, Psalm 45.
Psalm 45 is technically a royal wedding song. But in verse 6, the king is addressed with the words, "Your throne, O God, endures forever and ever." The writer of Hebrews takes that divine address, O God, and applies it directly to Christ to show his superiority over the angels. It's a confirmation of the divine nature of the ultimate ruler.
And finally, Psalm 110. This one is the most quoted messianic psalm in the whole New Testament.
It's foundational to New Testament Christology. It's referenced everywhere, from Matthew 22 to Acts 2 and all through Hebrews. It starts with that staggering line, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet."
And the fact that David calls his own descendant, my Lord, is the very point Christ used to confuse the Pharisees.
It is, and that position at God's right hand signifies ultimate authority. But Psalm 110 doesn't just talk about kingship, it introduces a whole new priesthood.
Verse 4. The Messiah will be a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Why is that so significant?
Because it's language that makes no sense unless it's fulfilled in Christ. The normal Levitical priesthood was temporary and based on Aaron's lineage. Melchizedek, from Genesis 14, was a king and a priest with no recorded beginning or end. So by making the Messiah a priest like Melchizedek, the psalm establishes a permanent priesthood based not on ritual succession but on an eternal life. He is both king and high priest forever.
Okay, so the royal psalms set the stage for the New Testament's understanding of who Jesus is. Now let's look at the two big emotional categories, the laments and the shocking imprecatory psalms.
Laments, as we said, are the backbone of the Psalter, about 50 of them. They are prayers from times of deep distress, but they're generalized through that poetic, stereotyped language.
And they follow a very consistent structure, which makes them such a helpful model for us even today.
They do. They start with a description of the distress, a cry of anguish. That's followed by a petition to God for help. Then, very often, there is an expression of confidence in God's faithfulness. And they almost always end with a promise to praise God for the deliverance they expect to receive. They model the journey from complaint to confidence.
Which brings us to the really difficult passages, the imprecatory psalms, the ones with pleas for God to judge and overthrow the wicked.
These are the passages that can genuinely shock a modern Christian, with language like we see in Psalm 109 or the brutal ending of Psalm 137. The source material offers a few mitigating factors to help us understand this language, not to excuse it, but to put it in its proper context.
How do we get our heads around that level of rage, the desire for the destruction of your enemy's children, as you see in Psalm 137?
We have to remember a couple of things. First, for them, the cry for vengeance was tied directly to God's public honor. Because their view of final judgment wasn't as developed, they believed justice had to be seen in this life. When the wicked prospered, it looked like God wasn't in control. So their prayer wasn't just personal spite, it was a burning desire for God's righteousness to be publicly vindicated on earth.
They're asking God to prove he is just, not just to settle a personal score.
That's the key distinction. The second factor is the communication style itself. The poetic Oriental worldview used hyperbole, extreme language, to express deep passion and outrage. It was meant to shock the reader into a sense of moral seriousness about evil.
Still, we have to view these through the lens of the fuller revelation in the New Testament.
We do. While those outbursts were maybe understandable in their covenantal context, the New Testament demands a different response. Christ calls us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us. Divine judgment is still a reality in the New Testament, but private vengeance is forbidden. The Old Testament believer surrendered their cause to God's temporal justice. We surrender ours to his final, eternal justice.
And just to round it out, let's circle back to the penitential Psalms, which perfectly illustrate that surrender to mercy.
Psalms 32, 51, 130, they are just filled with this intensity of feeling, this deep, agonizing sense of how enormous sin is in God's sight. And David's action in Psalm 51, throwing himself entirely on God's mercy instead of offering an insufficient sacrifice, is the ultimate illustration that true penitence is superior to any ritual.
The Psalter truly is a treasury of spiritual experience. It covers every aspect of communion with God, from the deepest sin to the highest joy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the value of the Psalter is just so clear. It is a treasury that reflects the entire messy, glorious range of communion with God, from bitter complaint and anguish all the way to joyous praise and messianic hope.
Martin Luther said that in the Psalter you can look into the heart of all the saints. And that strength of personal relationship with God that you see in Old Testament worship is just perfectly captured in these 150 prayers.
And because the psalmists used that stereotype language, giving so little specific historical detail, the Psalter has been able to be the universal hymn book for generation after generation of believers. I mean, our material lives are vastly different from ancient Israel, but God hasn't changed, and the basic spiritual needs of the human heart are exactly the same.
Okay, so here's where we leave you with a final thought to consider. The source material notes that the Book of Psalms was probably accepted as inspired, as canonical, much earlier than the rest of that section of the Old Testament known as the writings, possibly as early as 300 BC. That's at least 2,300 years ago.
So, if the Psalms were so readily and so universally accepted by God's people as their inspired worship guide, and so quickly, what does that immediate, widespread acceptance tell you about the recognizable voice of God speaking through its pages to the very core of the human heart?
It made them canonize their praise so fast. That's something to carry with you. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Book of Praises.